Hi, friends. I'm Lisa Q, Program Director at the JCC Association of North America's Sheva Center, our Early Childhood Department. And this is a little session on blocks and getting yourself organized and ready to set up your block areas in your classrooms. We're going to talk a little bit about surfacing strengths and challenges of your space, what you need to do to prepare to set up a block area, and give you some information about the stages of block play so you can observe and know what children are investigating and thinking about so you can then support and extend that play. And then we'll talk a little bit about planning for your space and trying it out. So let's do a little bit of thinking. I want you to do a quick write about what's working in your block area or block play in your classroom if you don't have an area yet, and what you might change or shift or add to the space to make it more attractive for children, to make the play more functional, anything you want to see change. And then if you do, you can think about what's your question about this space. Maybe you've been thinking about something for a little while. So pause the presentation, do some thinking, and then you can come on back. All right, so now that you've done a little thinking and maybe raised some questions about your play, and maybe you even had time to talk with somebody else about it before moving on to this session, let's talk about how we need to prepare for play in our environments. First, we want to choose the types of blocks that we want to have. Sometimes we refer to these as micro play or macro play. I would define macro as those big unit blocks that many classrooms have. Micro might be smaller blocks or props that we put in our block area. And the second thing we need to do to prepare is to organize the space for both building and cleanup. So, and you'll see some pictures of some of these things in the next slides. You want to have an area that's 2 or 3 sides. Sometimes I see blocks in a bucket off to the side and there's really nowhere to take them, or they're competing for space with other things. Blocks need to have their own dedicated space in a 2 or 3 sided area. And sometimes I put, if I don't have furniture that does this, I'll put tape on the floor to demarcate a building area. And I always put some tape right in front of the block shelf to make a space where no building happens, so there's room for children to kneel and pull blocks off the shelf. We want to have outlines of blocks on the shelf, and you'll see that in a moment. And I would urge you to consider limiting the number of children who go into that space so that their building can become more powerful, more enriched. Uh, I would often have a little necklace on the outside of the block area somewhere, and children would put those necklaces on. 3 to 5 children, depending on the size of your space. If there's no necklaces, then children know that that area is full, and maybe you have a sign-up sheet that they can use to know who to tap on their shoulder next when a child leaves that area. And then we want to teach explicitly norms for using the blocks. This is probably the most crucial thing that you can do. In the beginning of the year, or if there are new children who come in, I take them into the block area. We talk about all the different props, how to take blocks off, how to handle them carefully, and how to put them away. And as you'll see as we move forward, I often, depending on what I'm observing with children in the block area, will give some demonstrations on different kinds of block building strategies and techniques. How do we build high? How do we build a pattern? How do I put things on top of each other? And in the beginning, at least initially, and maybe forever, you want to not have too much stuff in the block area. Children can get easily overwhelmed, pull things off shelves just to see them, then not actually know how to incorporate them into their structure. So I always start out with less blocks than I think children are going to need. I can always add more. So here's a not ideal block area that the teacher, I asked her, tell me a little bit about your block area. And she said, well, I just have them in tubs because it's easier for kids to put things away. Well, what she really meant was that it's easier for her to have children put things away if they just dump them into buckets with no organization or order. What makes this difficult is it's harder for children to find the block they need and to make connections between blocks that are alike, blocks that are different, blocks that have different purposes. So this is not what we want to have happen in our block areas. Instead, we want an organized, beautiful block shelf that helps children to understand where to put things and the different properties of different kinds of blocks. Now, the one on the right has some nice PVC props, but they didn't get around to putting the outlines, the paper outlines on the shelves. And I would urge you to do that so that the shelf actually says to the child, please put this kind of block here and that kind of block there. Again, it helps them to understand the properties of these different kinds of blocks and makes it easier for them to find and to clean up in a way that is organized and ready for the next person. So here's your setup. On the top left is a little cover that I made for my block shelf to indicate when blocks were open and closed. You can decide blocks don't have to be open 24/7 in your classroom. And then when that cover was down, then children could knew that it was open. And my necklaces were there, so children could put those necklaces on. And then you can see the arrows pointing to the little paper outline. So I would trace a block, cut it out, and then put some clear contact paper. I would recommend contact paper instead of packing tape. Packing tape tends to doesn't lay as smoothly on, or nor does it come off as easily on a wooden shelf or a painted shelf. So I'd really recommend contact paper and not packing tape for this use. And notice on the left, there's some props on the top that I rotate and a book with pictures of the children's block structures called the Block Book. And there's a close-up of just another way that a teacher wanted to label her shelf. She actually put the names of the blocks on there as well. That's certainly an option. Here's one more example of different kinds of ways to organize props in a block area. Notice the flat boards. A parent cut those up, or sometimes you can get them at a hardware store, or you might know somebody in the building industry or a flooring company. These are nice, beautiful, flat pieces. Kids love to build on top of those, especially if your rug is bumpy. And on the bottom are some giant tiles from a reclaimed tile store. So cleanup. So here you can see a lot of things here that I want to point out that are going well. One is you can see that piece of blue tape on the floor, the teacher's sitting on it, and there's another child on one side of it. This is the no build zone, and it gives you a place to kneel and not disturb other people's structures while you are taking blocks out and putting them away. On the right-hand side, there's some documentation on a bulletin board of children building so that they can get inspired by their constructions. So there are various stages of block building that you want to watch for, and I'll go through each of these, but they are carrying blocks and knocking down. We'll talk a little bit about knocking down, stacking and making roads, connecting blocks to create structures like bridging, making enclosures, designs, and making more elaborate constructions. And these do move in a developmental trajectory from very young children to older children, where we initially see children, our infants and toddlers, they just want to carry them. Our infants just want to put them in their mouths. But we offer them some kinds of blocks so they get used to seeing them, and then we start they'll stack a few and knock down. They do this with things like those nesting boxes, which are a great initial block toy for young children. Eventually, we want to, I wouldn't say discourage knocking down, but we want to be able to focus more on the construction piece of things if kids want to knock things down, I don't give them unit blocks to do it. I might create something else with lighter cardboard items where they can stack and knock down in a safe way. But when kids are building and really constructing, we talk about building and then deconstructing and taking things down very carefully and intentionally so that our blocks stay beautiful and no one gets hurt. So one of the first things we see is stacking, and then there's sort of multiple ways that children stack. So I want to offer them things to stack and then demonstrate and show how I might put things on top of each other. I do this a lot in infant toddler rooms where, kids have pulled things off shelves and things are sort of laying around, and I might just gather a few things around, whether it's blocks or those stacking cubes or any other kind of manipulative, and I just start stacking, not too high, but then I might put something smaller on top to invite a new way of playing. But you'll see this when you watch for it, and you see kids start to stack, then you can come along and participate in that stacking. As children get older, they want to stack to build big. You have to make decisions. Can kids stand on chairs? How tall can they build? I never had a rule. I've heard, okay, you can only build as high as your shoulder. When kids started to want to build big, then I would stop the play, not right in the middle of it necessarily, although I might do that. But we would have a conversation about it in a small group or at a group meeting to decide, okay, kids are really wanting to build big. How are we going to do this safely, in a way that doesn't hurt our friends? And maybe it means standing on a stool. Maybe it means having a spotter. Maybe it means getting a teacher to support you. So we need to have those conversations about how do we build big safely, and what are building strategies that support balance. Kids will experiment with balance, and you can observe that experimentation, and at some point you can also offer some strategies. I think we'll have some pictures of those in a bit. So once children move from stacking, then you start to see also lining up. So kids will line up all kinds of things. They'll line up their cars, their trucks, all kinds of things. There's been some interesting concern about kids who line things up, and is that an obsessive compulsion to do that? And in a way it is part of their sense of order, and so I actually will do some of that lining up. If I see cars and toys all over the place, I don't have to necessarily put them back on the shelf, especially for our infants and toddlers, but I will line them up in different places around the room or on the shelves to provide another provocation and room for them to move. In my block area, children will often line things up to make roads. They're really interested in this idea of moving things from one place to another. It's part of the foundational play schemas that children engage in. And so I'm watching for that to see how they make roads and what goes on those roads. Enclosures is another important aspect of children's play, another foundational play schema of encircling things. It creates a sense of safety in their play to create spaces for things to go inside. Often they'll make things for themselves to go inside. They'll make an enclosure and then sit in it. How big does it need to be? So there's all kinds of wonderful skills that happen in block play: estimation, measurement, counting, shape discrimination. Note that these children are building outside. This was an old set of blocks that I had that I used on a little concrete patio, and those were our outdoor blocks. And those didn't follow necessarily my pattern because of the storage I had outside. So I did have those in a big crate, and there was a limited set of them. But we stacked them in there. We put them away carefully and took good care of our blocks. You'll start to see children as they get older bridge things. They'll want to make connections. It's kind of a beautiful extension of the stacking of enclosures and of roads, of those pathways that they create. And as they experiment with balance, and this one's interesting, it's a little bit hard to tell, but if you look closely, you can see that there's a flat block atop these tall pillars, and then on top of that are two longer blocks placed horizontally to create stability and a road that was like a bridge. This is another sophisticated example of bridging using the curved blocks. Make sure you have blocks that are of different shapes and sizes, and then you see a little stacking there and more bridging with the longer flat blocks and the long sort of 2x4 block. So here's another roads, but in a more sophisticated way that includes bridging, that includes pathways, that also includes enclosures. So you'll start to see these things come together as children become more sophisticated in their block play. And they will naturally, and we saw this in the last slide, move towards ramps and thinking about ramps in a functional way. This is a great time to bring in units on force and motion, what makes something move, how fast does it go, conversation for another day, but that's a beautiful way to ease yourself into some physics and some interesting STEM work. And this is really science, technology, engineering, and if we add the art, and I think that blocks are part of artistic expression and thinking about sculpture and architecture, then we can expand children's knowledge in that way as well. And here's a child you can see on the picture on the right-hand side going to the block area and then moving them to this platform that the children have built. That is not a table. It is something that the children built, and those were 5-year-olds. They'll start to make different designs and patterns depending on the kinds of props that we offer them. And I love these little tiny domino-like blocks. You can use dominoes if you want, but these little wooden, they're like sort of 2x3 or 1.5x2. I'm not sure of the exact size, but they're just right to fit in children's hands, and children will start to embellish their structures in all kinds of interesting ways if we offer them these. You could also just offer these with a few selections of blocks for toddlers to experiment with what this kind of block does and what that kind of block does. Maybe every few weeks I rotate different shapes so that they can begin to form a relationship with those blocks. There's another interesting piece here, which is they're building on top of a box. And so sometimes offering children enclosures that are ready-made, they'll do all kinds of interesting things with them. The hollow blocks that you saw in the Building Big structure are also a form of this, but offering them a way to expand and extend these is a great idea. And then we talked about children will start to make patterns. This was one way that a child started to build. He started with just one and then another. And then I came along and said, I wonder what would happen if you continued this strategy. This is a very interesting strategy that you've come up with. I wonder what would happen. And then he continued to build and create this pattern, which enabled him to build high, but enabled him to also have something novel, unique. And then he became the expert on that and shared his building strategies with other friends. The designs, they will continue. They don't, as we saw with the one that had the bridges and the pathways and the roads and the enclosures, they don't leave those by the wayside. They just become more sophisticated as children develop block play strategies. And so sometimes they'll build enclosures and the design ends up being inside. I mean, this is almost like a cobblestone road. And I would get pictures of cobblestone roads once I saw kids building that way and share. This is a complex stacking where they use the curve blocks to create something round. Can we make things that are round with blocks? What does that look like? This is a group of kindergartners engaged in ongoing block play. That's another decision-making point for you all, is to think a little bit about can they leave things up for a few days? Are there children who are engaged in ongoing complex constructions with deep and sophisticated play themes? I want to point out here a bunch of different aspects of this block area. One is the documentation behind them to inspire some things that they have been thinking about and talking about related to space. There's some space props there because, again, that was something kids were interested in. There's a green line demarcating where block play starts and where it stops in this particular classroom. And there are also some risers, and I'll show you some ways to make those at the end of these slides. So there's a lot going on here. You can see bridging, you can see enclosures, you can see roads. They're incorporating everything they know about block play into this theme of play. And this went on for a few days. People often ask, well, what about the other children who want to play with blocks? Well, but they can have a conversation about when it will be their time to be in block play, and then you need to talk with these children about when they need to shift their play, still can be connected to something they're interested in, but to different materials in a different space. So it's a negotiation, which they're ready to do. And here's another very sophisticated block structure that two children worked on for quite some time. Taking photographs after they've used all the blocks. Okay, so now we know it either has to change or we keep it up for people to admire, and then we engage in the careful process of taking it down. Complex designs also come out with different props that can be in your block area. Working with mandalas with found objects and loose parts is a beautiful thing to introduce to children as part of play with loose parts. And I would consider blocks a loose part, and we add loose parts to them, but then teaching how to use some of the props that we put in is sort of a sidebar to them using them in the block area in a constructive way. So I'll show you a few more photos about shifting and extending play, how we can support especially older children in planning, how we demonstrate building techniques and using novel materials, and then using content to promote some dramatic play. So we talked a little bit about blocks outside. This was a nature center in a city where they had different pieces of wood, but also incorporated bricks that were part of the play. Really lovely for heavy work. And I've seen people use bricks very successfully inside as well as outside. Has to be taught. They're heavy, and if they drop on your toe, it will hurt you. So you have to think carefully about, how am I going to introduce heavier items for children to play? They treat them with great respect once we teach the children how to use them, and they do different things with these heavy items than they do with the lighter ones. Offering children opportunities to combine blocks and shadows. This teacher had an old overhead projector with and shone the light on the block play and had a help with the children to see, okay, how close can I build to the wall if I really want to see the image? But then this also afforded a beautiful space in between the wall and the blocks for dramatic play to happen. So the shadow play was a wonderful piece of learning about light and shadow, but it also created a novel play space where children could have their own shadows be part of the play. Utilizing mirrors in your block area is also another way for children to see their own work reflected in the space. There's some lovely documentation here. There's some maps that the teacher was using, and you see the giant hollow blocks where we talked about ready-made shapes and structures, and then they have some open frames. So there's some interesting novel materials here in addition to the mirrors and the photos that inspire a different way of building. Sometimes roads can be you can get very concrete about it. So this teacher put, I think it's like sticky sandpaper on some blocks that she was willing to sacrifice with some lines to promote some road building for children who were interested in it, but needed a little scaffolding around it. She also had children create their own vehicles with their own drawings and put them on the blocks so that their participation in this play scheme, in this play theme, was something that they had connection to. And children offered these up for the group, so it was a great empathy piece where, yep, I drew this, but it's not just mine, it's part of the now of the block set that we have. Here's a close-up of their drawings taped onto the blocks. You have to think carefully. You're going to sacrifice some blocks. They're going to get sticky as the papers shred a bit and need some upkeep there, but it's a decision if you have enough blocks that you can make. That's a lovely way for children to be participating in the materials themselves. And there's a little close-up of it. And actually, it looks less like sticky sandpaper, although I've seen that, and more like just construction paper. So planning for block play is something you can do with young children and older children. These children were creating shapes on a geoboard and then translating what they made on the geoboard to their block play. Little higher level work here, but they wanted to make that transfer, and there was a prompt about can you make what you built on the geoboard, and can you build what you made on the geoboard with blocks, and vice versa. So it went both ways. Sometimes children love to draw before they build, to do a little planning, a little thinking. I wonder what you might construct today. I wonder if drawing might help us to get a sense of where you want to put the blocks and what planning looks like. This is what architects and builders do all the time. They don't necessarily go in spontaneously, and helping children to take a step back to do some thinking. I might do this verbally with younger children. What are you going to build today? Tell me the story of your building, to help children get more intentional and more reflective. And then we saw some of the documentation before, but working from a photograph. This child is actually working from a photograph of something that he built a week or so ago that needed to get put away and that he wanted to rebuild. So he is very intentionally, not exactly the same because he did it a little differently the next few times. And that's where that block book came from, where we had the photographs in there and children could share their good ideas about block building with each other, and then do this very interesting task. This is a 4-year-old, of transferring into 3D what they see in 2D. And then teaching techniques. So the technique on the left, I taught with some Cuisenaire rods, some smaller blocks, and then children transferred that technique using the big blocks, of making these sort of pattern of these hashtags back and forth to across, sort of like you start Jenga, and that this is an actually really interesting strategy to use this pattern to build something tall and high. And then the child on the right took it a step further and added her own embellishments on the top. So using different materials to teach techniques, smaller blocks, and then transferring those to the block area. And then solving problems. So you're doing this all the time anyway, but I just wanted to point it out. This child wanted desperately to make this very tall, flat block stand up. How was he going to do it? So he's in conversation with a teacher who's doing a little balancing there with his hand, and then a friend to think about, what do they need in order to make this kind of block balance and stand up? He went through many trials of it falling down. We let him engage in that productive struggle before asking for some supports, for some ideas, and then testing them out. And sometimes changing the venue is a really nice way to engage children in block play, like using your sensory table with some novel blocks that are smaller, that encourage some building. Look at this beautiful city that they're working on. Lots of conversation, not too much stuff, right? The blocks are just these cylinders and then some little cubes and prisms. And they spent a long time figuring out how to organize these and where to put them. You can even see them observing their own work, taking stock and seeing what's going to come next. And here's an even bigger mandala that went on for a couple of days. You can see there's a cover over the shelves on the left because this mandala took up the space, and so we needed to close off some other areas so that children were protecting this space. Bringing in natural materials. You saw some in the photos if you caught it, little discs, little tree cookies. These were also sticks that children collected, and then we would wash them and sand them and make them smooth so that they were ready for the block area. And I believe there's also some lovely seashells here, combined with a couple of very carefully chosen blocks. These children are also engaged in design, mandala, and had been inspired by the work of other children and of the artist Andrew Goldsworthy, who does some amazing nature work. I love this for all ages of children to be able to have some spaces defined that provoke different kinds of play. If kids are into cars, help them to make a parking lot. How do we create spaces for organization, for play, for storytelling? And sometimes some simple tape can be helpful for that. And then putting photographs of families and children on the block so that they have representations of themselves creates new ways for dramatic play to unfold in our block areas. And we talked about this a little bit with space. You can see it again, but if there are studies that children are working on and are interested in, and you want to bring some of those into block play to create new ways of them talking and thinking about building something that's directly related to something they want to know more about and are curious about, your block area can do that. And then finally, I'll just talk about risers because they show up in some of our pictures, and building on different platforms gives children an interesting perspective. So here's an example of a small riser just up against a block shelf. It's covered with carpet. I wanted you to see behind the scenes a little bit. It's just a wooden riser that someone built, and then carpet is tacked over it. I would put something on the back of this so it's not so rough looking, maybe a pegboard of some sort, or a board where I could have documentation. And then here's another example of a beautiful multi-level space with block areas, 2 block shelves actually, defined with the red outlines and a space to build on both up and down. That's a luxury of space, but sometimes putting just a very small riser can be helpful. I hope you found this helpful today, and that you are seeing your block area in a new way. Be sure to reach out to the Sheva Center if you have questions about block play, and we'll see you soon.